Single dad sold everything to educate his twin daughters. 25 years later, they gave him this. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where real stories shine through the darkest moments. Today, we begin with a question that may haunt every struggling parent. Would you give up everything you own just for the chance your child might succeed? Elias did. He was a poor cobbler with nothing but his tools and two baby girls left in his arms after tragedy struck. People laughed when he sold his only shop to keep them in school. Girls will marry and leave, they said. You're wasting your life. But Elias believed in something stronger than doubt. He believed in them. And 25 years later, those same girls returned with something that silenced the world. You won't believe what they did. But before we dive into this heart-stirring story of sacrifice, faith, and an ending you'll never forget, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Cracks of Light. Your support helps us bring more stories that prove one truth. Light always finds a way through. Elias had never planned to be a single father. But when his wife Maria walked out just days after giving birth to their twin daughters, Zoe and Luna, he found himself standing alone in their cramped, crumbling apartment with two infants in his arms and a heart cracked open by betrayal. The neighborhood watched from behind torn curtains. They whispered, judged, and assumed he would give up or give the girls away. A cobbler with barely enough to feed himself. How could he raise two babies? Elias didn't answer them. He simply tightened the straps of his old apron, placed the girls in a handmade cradle by the workbench, and got back to stitching saws like his life depended on it. Because it did. Every morning before sunrise, he swept the dust from his shop floor, balance bottles, diapers, and tiny onesies in a cloth bag, and walked the twins to the old daycare center that charged by the mercy of the staff, not by the hour. Then he returned to patch leather, glue torn heels, and hammer-worn boots into shape. His hands bled before the week was over. His back ached before the month passed. And when the daycare said they could no longer accept the girls without pay, he brought them to the shop and worked with one baby tied to his chest and the other asleep in a drawer lined with old towels. On nights when they cried in tandem and his stomach groaned from missed meals, Elias sat on the edge of their makeshift crib and whispered promises into the dark. He didn't know how or when, but he vowed that his girls would never grow up like he did, barefoot in alleys, unlettered, unseen. They would read. They would finish school. They would walk into rooms with their heads high, no matter what it cost him. That cost became real quickly. The milk cans ran dry. The shelves grew bare. The neighborhood that once scoffed now offered pitying glances, but no help. He considered stealing. He considered begging. Then one afternoon, as he wandered past the old bookstore where Maria once volunteered, he saw the door half open. Inside stood Ruth, the owner, with thick glasses and a sharper heart. She remembered him. More importantly, she remembered Maria's kindness, how she used to teach neighborhood kids to read for free in the back corner of the store. Ruth listened silently as Elias explained his situation, the girls, the hunger, the despair he tried not to show. Then she disappeared into the back room and returned with two small glass bottles filled with donated breast milk and a loaf of bread still warm. They're everyone's daughters now, she said simply, placing the bottles in his trembling hands. That night, Elias cried for the first time since Maria left. Not from pain, but from the shock of unexpected kindness. He fed the girls drop by drop, then rocked them to sleep while humming the lullabies Maria once sang in the kitchen. He didn't have a wife, a savings account, or even a steady meal plan, but he had two daughters breathing softly in his arms and a renewed sense of direction. The next day, he returned to Ruth's bookstore with a pair of worn shoes from a customer who never came back. He cleaned and polished them until they shone, then left them by her door with a note, "Repayment in progress." Over the next few weeks, Elias stitched cloth diapers from old curtains, learned how to make baby food from root vegetables, and created a mobile from broken shoelaces and cardboard stars to hang above the twins' crib. Neighbors continued to judge. Some offered unsolicited advice. Others warned him that girls were too fragile to be raised by a man alone. But Elias didn't answer. He just kept working, kept learning, and kept loving louder than the noise around him. Zoe was the first to smile. Luna was the first to crawl. Elias missed both moments because he was in the back room boiling formula substitutes in a rusted pot. But when he saw them afterward, Zoe clapping her tiny hands, Luna chewing on a wooden spoon, he wept again. Not out of guilt, but because he knew they were surviving. And in the quiet hours after they had drifted to sleep, he sat by the window with a journal borrowed from Ruth and wrote down his vow again and again like scripture. My daughters will go to school. My daughters will finish school. My daughters will rise. He didn't know then how many nights he would sleep on the floor beside them. He didn't know how many meals he'd skip or how many repairs he'd trade for groceries. But he knew this. The world would not decide the future for Zoe and Luna. Their father already had. Elias spent his days hunched over broken saws, patching worn leather for customers who often couldn't pay in full, and his nights threading needles by candlelight, turning torn shirts into makeshift blankets to keep his daughters warm. The cold bit harder than hunger sometimes, but watching Zoe babble her first word and Luna sway her body clumsily to the rhythm of old radio jingles made him believe that joy could still find them. The milestones came quietly, without fanfare. Zoe pointed to letters on a cereal box and mimicked sounds. Luna danced when she heard water drip into a bucket. Elias noticed everything and clung to those small moments like lifelines. But joy didn't pay rent. The landlord gave them notice after 2 missed payments. Elias tried to negotiate, offering to repair the man's entire boot collection in exchange for another month. It bought them 5 extra days. On the 6th, Elias wrapped his tools in a cloth sack, carried Zoe on one shoulder, Luna on the other, and walked them to an abandoned shack near the edge of town. A place once used to store scrap metal now, home to rats and forgotten things. He cleaned it the best he could with a broom made of Tide rags, covered the cracks with cardboard, and whispered to his girls, "This is home now." They adapted faster than he did. Children do. Elias found work at a nearby factory loading crates when cobbling slowed down. The pay was miserable, the hours long, but it came with leftover food on lucky days. He still kept his repair tools close, sometimes fixing a foreman's shoes in exchange for extra rice. Every evening, no matter how exhausted, he drew letters in charcoal on the back wall and taught his daughters how to read, using torn newspapers and old flyers. He made up stories about the people in the photos. He turned headlines into spelling tests. He traced their names again and again until they could do it with their eyes closed. The shack had no electricity, but he fashioned a lantern out of a glass jar and leftover cooking oil. When it flickered out, they studied by moonlight or not at all. Ruth, the bookstore owner, occasionally sent over old children's books with missing pages. Elias taped them together like puzzles. He was raising 2 readers in a house with no shelves. And somehow that made sense. The neighbors, or what counted as neighbors in the Shanty area, started to notice. A few offered advice, most of it unwelcome. They told him children needed a mother's hand, not just a father's heart. That no matter how much he loved them, it wouldn't be enough. That it was time to consider remarrying, not for love, but for practicality. One woman in particular, a vendor at the local market, offered to introduce him to a widow she knew who was good with children and didn't mind small spaces. Elias nodded politely and said he'd think about it. He didn't. At night, after the girls had fallen asleep under patchwork quilts that smelled faintly of glue and smoke, Elias sat outside on a broken chair and stared at the city lights in the distance. He didn't resent the suggestion. He just didn't believe anyone else would protect Zoe and Luna the way he did. Not after what they'd already survived. Not with how hard he had fought to keep them learning, laughing, and dreaming in a world that barely acknowledged their right to be more than invisible. There were days when hope was harder to hold. When Luna got sick and Elias couldn't afford medicine, he boiled herbs and prayed. When Zoe asked why they didn't have birthday cakes like the children she saw on billboards, he carved her name into a piece of wood and told her it was magic. When he ran out of thread, he unraveled the lining of his own jacket just to sew another blanket seam. Still, every time one of them spelled a new word or asked a question he didn't know how to answer, Elias felt something deeper than survival. He felt purpose, and that, more than any marriage, gave him strength. He wasn't blind to reality. He knew his daughters needed more than what he could provide in that shack beside the garbage heap. But he also knew what they didn't need: another adult with half a heart and 1 foot out the door. So he stitched another shoe, folded another lesson plan out of newspaper, and whispered his vow once more. No matter how dark the world gets, my girls will carry light. Elias didn't go looking for love. He went looking for help. It had been nearly 7 years since Maria left, and though Zoe and Luna were growing stronger, smarter, more independent by the day, the weight of doing it all alone never lightened. When a friend from the factory introduced him to Claire, a soft-spoken widow who had lost her husband in a road accident, Elias didn't feel fireworks. He felt relief. She was polite, well-mannered, said all the right things. She listened when he spoke about his daughters. She complimented their intelligence, praised their manners, even brought them little gifts on her second visit: a ribbon for Zoe's hair, a second-hand picture book for Luna. Elias saw their faces light up. He thought maybe, just maybe, this woman could be the missing piece. They had a simple ceremony under a mango tree near the market, witnessed by 3 friends, 2 neighbors, and Ruth, who gave him a Bible with their names written in gold pen. Claire moved in that evening. The first weeks were warm. She cooked well, cleaned without complaint, and read bedtime stories with the same rhythm Maria once had. Elias caught himself hoping. He allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to raise his daughters with a partner, not just someone who shared chores, but someone who truly cared. But then, slowly the small shifts began. Claire stopped reading to the girls and started correcting their speech sharply. She no longer asked how school went. She criticized their posture, their handwriting, their tone. Elias brushed it off as an adjustment period. Blending families wasn't easy. He told himself not to overreact. But the first real alarm came when Luna came home with a red mark on her wrist and wouldn't say how it happened. Zoe said Claire had grabbed her too hard when she didn't clean up fast enough. Elias asked Claire directly. She denied it, said the girls were too sensitive, not used to structure. He wanted to believe her. He needed to. Then came the night everything cracked. Elias arrived home later than usual, hand-stained with shoe polish, back aching from a double shift. He opened the door to screaming. Claire was standing in the kitchen, holding a wooden spoon like a weapon, yelling about spilled stew. Zoe was crying. Luna was hiding under the table. The pot lay broken on the floor, sauce across the tiles. Claire turned mid-sentence and shouted, "They're just like their mother. Useless." And then, without pause, she slapped Zoe across the face. Elias froze for half a second. Then something broke loose inside him. He stepped between Claire and the girls, voice shaking but firm. "You touch them again, and you answer to me and to God." Claire laughed bitterly, called him a fool. "No one wanted a man stuck with 2 motherless girls," she hissed. She packed her things before dawn and slammed the gate behind her. No tears. No apology. Zoe sat on the edge of the bed that night, cheeks swollen, her eyes wide but dry. Luna curled up next to her, silent. Elias couldn't bring himself to speak. He just sat there, shoulders hunched, staring at the floor. He had made the one mistake he swore he never would. He let someone hurt his daughters under his roof. The guilt was unbearable. He replayed every warning sign he'd ignored, every small act of cruelty he'd excused. In trying to find them a family, he'd endangered the only thing that mattered. From that night on, he changed. He became more guarded, more inward. He refused invitations from coworkers. He no longer entertained introductions. When Ruth mentioned someone she thought he might like, he simply shook his head. He braided the girl's hair himself now, even if it came out uneven. He cooked, even if he burned half the meals. He handled homework, even when he didn't understand the math. Every scraped knee, every school form, every birthday candle, they were all his to manage. He wasn't bitter. He was focused. Trust was a currency he no longer had to spend. The girls never asked about Claire again. They didn't need to. The lesson was carved in silence. From then on, Elias didn't just raise his daughters. He protected them from anything that even smelled like harm. Because once a father breaks his own vow, there's only one way back, to keep it stronger than ever before. When the acceptance letters arrived from the district middle school, Elias didn't celebrate. He ran numbers in his head. Uniforms, textbooks, school fees, transportation, more than 3 months' income even before groceries. Zoe and Luna were beaming, chattering about which subjects they'd take, what clubs they'd join. He nodded along, smiled, and quietly excused himself. That night, after they'd gone to bed, he sat in the back of his shop, the same one he'd inherited from his father, the same one he'd slept in during the first years alone, and stared at the walls like they were strangers. Every inch held a memory. Every shelf had been hammered, sanded, stained by his hands. But memories didn't pay tuition. He listed the shop for sale the next morning. Word spread fast. Some customers cried. Some called him foolish. "You'll never find another place like this," one man warned. "You're selling your whole life." Elias nodded. "I am buying theirs." It took 2 weeks to find a buyer. The price wasn't generous, but it was enough, barely. He signed the papers without blinking. Then he handed the keys to a man with soft hands and walked away, carrying only his toolbox and the names of his daughters written on the inside of his collar. With the money, he paid the school fees, bought second-hand uniforms, and found a tiny rental room behind the city central library. It was small, 1 bed, 1 light bulb, no kitchen, but close enough for the girls to walk to school and for him to look for work. He applied for janitor positions, construction gigs, night watch jobs. He was 52, with bad knees and no diploma. Most doors closed quickly. One opened. The library needed a cleaner. Pay was low. Hours started before dawn. He accepted on the spot. He swept marble floors, dusted shelves, scrubbed bathrooms, and oiled hinges before the city woke. Every day, he collected torn books discarded in the back room, pages with missing covers, spines broken beyond repair. He taped them, restapled them, brought them home, and stacked them in a corner beside the mattress. "No story deserves the trash," he told the girls. Each night after dinner, Zoe and Luna read those broken books aloud, taking turns, correcting each other's pronunciation. Elias listened while patching their shoes and re-sewing frayed collars. He didn't always understand the subjects, but he understood the drive. He'd seen it in their mother's eyes once. He saw it now in theirs. They studied late. They never complained. Zoe developed a love for physics. Luna became obsessed with how machines worked. When their teachers sent home progress reports with notes like exceptional and gifted, Elias folded the papers into his wallet like currency. He began tracking their academic performance like a banker watching interest rise. When they won a school science quiz and were invited to a regional fair, he borrowed a button-down shirt from a neighbor so he could attend as their chaperone. He stood in the back of the auditorium, silent, proud, fists clenched around the tears he refused to let fall. Their home was cramped, the mattress thin, and the single light bulb flickered every time the rain came. But there was laughter, always laughter. Zoe made up riddles. Luna built a lamp out of scrap wires that somehow worked better than the real one. Elias cooked whatever he could afford, beans, rice, sometimes just hot water and spices, and they turned every meal into a feast by trading stories and jokes over tin bowls. One evening, Luna asked if he missed the shop. He paused. "I miss the smell of leather," he said, "but I'd rather smell ink on your notebooks." Occasionally, people still whispered. They saw him emptying trash bins and wiping floors, and assumed he had failed. They didn't see the twin girls tucked in the reading room after school, doing homework beside their father's mop bucket. They didn't see the way librarians left out extra books by accident, or how Ruth occasionally slipped cash into library return envelopes. The world assumed dignity came from wealth. Elias knew it came from sacrifice. The girls knew it too. They studied because they didn't want to waste his gift. Every time they felt tired, they remembered him coming home with blistered hands, but still asking, "Need help with math?" Every time they doubted themselves, they pictured him in that oversized janitor uniform, head down, pushing a broom with purpose. Elias never asked for thanks. He asked for effort, and in return, they gave everything. They ranked in the top 5 of their class by year's end. Zoe was offered a summer internship at a local science museum. Luna volunteered to fix broken radios at the community center. They came home each night with more questions, more ideas, more dreams. Elias couldn't always keep up with their vocabulary, but he memorized every dream like a blueprint. He no longer needed a sign above a door to prove he was a craftsman. He was building something far more durable. He was shaping two lives. And every time he sharpened a pencil stub or ironed their uniforms with steam from boiled water, he reminded himself, the shop was never the legacy. They were. Zoe fell in love with the sky the first time she saw a plane cut through it. She memorized engine sounds the way other kids memorize pop lyrics. Luna, on the other hand, was always tearing things apart. Remote controls, fans, even a broken toaster she found near the trash bins, just to understand how they worked. By 16, Zoe had declared she would be a pilot. Luna wanted to be an aerospace engineer. Elias never questioned it. He only asked, "What do we need to get there?" They both applied for scholarships. Weeks passed. Then letters arrived, one after the other, stamped and sealed like keys to another world. Zoe was accepted to Emerald Air Academy. Luna to TechFront University's mechanical engineering program. They screamed, danced, cried. Elias sat quietly, rereading each line. The tuition fees were partial. The rest was on them. Elias didn't hesitate. He sold the last of his possessions, his wedding ring, a wooden dresser he'd built the year Zoe and Luna were born, and finally his old cobbler's tools. The same tools his father once used. He wrapped them in cloth, walked them to a pawn shop, and left with enough to cover the first semester. Word spread quickly. Neighbors shook their heads. Some laughed. "They'll just marry rich and forget you," one said. "You're investing in wings that'll fly away." Elias smiled. Let them fly. He didn't argue. He had mops to push, toilets to scrub. Every day before dawn, he cleaned the library floors until they shone, took on extra hours at a nearby office building, then video called his daughters at night to quiz them on lessons or simply tell them, "I'm proud of you." When Zoe called after her first simulator test, voice trembling with excitement, he repeated the line so many times she started crying. When Luna sent him pictures of her first circuit board project, he printed them and taped them to the wall. They didn't have a proper desk in their dorm, so they studied on beds, shared books, ate noodles, and saved every penny. They volunteered at school events, took tutoring jobs, anything to lessen the burden. Elias never told them how hard things were getting, that the rent had gone up, that his back ached constantly, that he sometimes skipped dinner so he could save for their textbooks. He kept his smile ready every call, kept telling them one day at a time. When Luna's laptop crashed, Elias worked 2 double shifts and sent the money for a refurbished replacement. When Zoe needed a flight uniform, he borrowed from a church fund and paid it back cleaning pews after midnight. The twins never forgot. Every small help became another reason to study harder. They climbed their class rankings, earned partial grants, and became known on campus for their work ethic and drive. Zoe built a reputation as the most prepared student in the flight school. Luna's designs started drawing attention from visiting engineers. Elias watched all of it from afar, collecting screenshots and quotes, taping news mentions to the inside of his closet. When his co-workers mocked him, "Bet they're dating by now. But they don't even remember you," he just nodded. Then he'd whisper to himself, "They will remember everything." Each time he felt exhausted, he remembered Zoe's voice saying, "I passed," or Luna's handwriting on a letter that said, "You're the reason I believe in hard things." That was fuel. That was enough. He didn't need applause. He needed tuition deadlines met and dreams protected. They sent home pictures of airports and labs, annotated with jokes and gratitude. One night, Zoe called in tears. She'd passed a brutal exam, but lost a classmate to drop out. "What if I burn out?" she asked. Elias answered, "You won't. Because you're not doing this alone." Luna once texted, "I'm going to design something that flies. Not just planes, maybe lives." At the end of their second year, Zoe earned access to live flight training. Luna's team won a competition for developing lighter fuselage materials. Professors began to notice. Emails came. Industry eyes were on them. But Elias didn't change. He still woke up at 4, still cleaned until the gloves tore, still sent surprise meal money with silly notes written in block letters. When the neighborhood finally quieted down, it wasn't out of respect, it was out of disbelief. They had mocked him for years. Now they watched as the daughters of a janitor began to ascend. Elias never said, "I told you so." He just folded their latest grades into his wallet and whispered one more time, let them fly. Zoe was selected for an internship with Skirich International Airlines after impressing a visiting flight captain during a simulator evaluation. Her application had stood out not just for her technical scores, but for a short essay titled, "What My Father Taught Me About Altitude." Luna, meanwhile, had led her engineering team to victory in a national aerospace design competition with a prototype that reduced aircraft drag without increasing fuel use. The judges praised her precision. Her classmates called her genius. She said nothing, just called home that night and said, "We're getting closer, Papa." That week, reporters began calling. One blog picked up their story. That hit the evening news. Twin daughters of a janitor set to soar. One to the sky, one behind the machines. Photos from old student fairs, grainy pictures of Elias sweeping floors, and a video clip of him pushing a mop down a library corridor went viral. Someone labeled him the father who gave his wings away. The name stuck. The twins tried to avoid the spotlight, but their names spread. Donations came in, emails from parents across the country. Students asked to shadow them. Elias, when asked for a comment, simply said they did the work. "I just kept the lights on." But when Zoe and Luna received their first internship stipends, they didn't buy new clothes or gadgets. They pooled their money, opened a joint account, and filed paperwork for a nonprofit. It would offer scholarships for low-income students interested in aviation and engineering. They called it the Promise of Elias. The logo was a pair of hands holding paper planes. They made their father the honorary founder. He cried when they showed him the website. Soon after, Elias was contacted by a luxury hotel group. They'd seen his story. One of the board members used to bring boots to his shop 20 years earlier. They wanted him to consult on bespoke furniture for their newest property. High-end lobby pieces, custom desks, carved ceiling panels. They offered triple what he made as a janitor. Elias visited the site, walked the floors, studied the plans. Then he politely declined. He asked instead to use a small corner of the space and use storage to build a workshop for at-risk youth. "I've had enough applause," he said. "Let me pass on what I still have." The hotel agreed. They donated tools, materials, and covered insurance. By the end of the month, Elias had a dozen students. Most were teenagers who had dropped out or been labeled difficult. Elias didn't care about their records. He cared about how they handled wood, how they paid attention to detail. He taught them patience, balance, and how to fix what others threw away. He paid them in meals and the pride of finished work. Some didn't stay. The ones who did stayed late. Zoe and Luna visited the shop during breaks. Zoe gave talks about cockpit control systems. Luna brought scrap parts and taught aerodynamics using paper fan models. The scholarship fund grew faster than expected. A video of Elias teaching a boy how to shape a table leg went viral again. One comment read, "This man gave up everything so others could build something." A second hotel requested his work. He accepted, but only if he could bring his students. When a local university invited him to speak, he said no. When they asked again and promised the auditorium would be filled with engineering majors, he paused. "Only if I can bring two," he said. He brought Zoe and Luna. He stood on stage for 5 minutes, then stepped aside and let them speak. They told the story not of struggle, but of faith. Not of poverty, but of belief. Zoe ended her speech with the same words Elias had once told her before her first flight assessment. "Altitude is not about distance from the ground. It's about perspective." They returned home that night and sat on the floor of their tiny living room, eating simple food and laughing. The apartment was still small, but the world had expanded around them. Elias never asked for attention. He never wanted legacy, but he built one anyway, in wood, in sweat, in 2 daughters who once studied by oil lamp and now lit the skies. And every time a student from his workshop found work or got into school or simply said thank you, Elias marked the moment. Not with a speech, but with a quiet nod and a hand steady from years of labor, still teaching, still giving, still carving a future for whatever he had left. Claire returned with nothing but a canvas bag and a faded expression. Her second marriage had collapsed. The man she left Elias for had gambled through their savings, and whatever stability she thought she was trading up for had crumbled into debt and silence. She found Elias at the community center's woodworking room, teaching a teenager how to sand down a warped tabletop. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply said, "I need work." Elias looked at her for the first time in over a decade. Her face had changed. Her voice was lower, worn down. But the memory of Zoe's bruised cheek and Luna's silence wasn't gone. His instinct said no, but his heart, shaped by years of struggle and reflection, told him to ask one question. "Can you follow rules that don't serve you?" She nodded. That was enough. He gave her a part-time inventory role, far from the workshop floor, reporting to someone else, with a fixed schedule and a clear boundary. No contact with the students. No authority over anyone. A small job, but an honest one. When Zoe and Luna heard, they were furious. Zoe said nothing for 2 days. Luna called and asked why he would open the door to someone who once slammed it on them. Elias listened and then said, "Because we don't heal by repeating hurt. And I'm not inviting her into our lives. I'm giving her a way to fix her own." The girls didn't agree, but they didn't push further. They had learned to trust that their father didn't move recklessly. He moved with intent. Claire showed up early every day. She filed receipts, stocked materials, and kept her head down. She never asked for more. She didn't try to talk to Elias outside of work matters. She made coffee for the staff and ate her lunch alone. Some volunteers were supportive. Others questioned his decision loudly. Social media split in two, half calling Elias the embodiment of grace, half calling him a fool too soft to draw lines. He didn't care. He didn't post. He didn't respond. He just clocked in and kept teaching. One afternoon, after nearly 3 months, Claire asked to speak to him. He expected a resignation. Instead, she handed him a short note. "Thank you for letting me face myself," it read. "I never blamed you. I blamed everything but myself." That was the real damage. He read it once and put it in the drawer next to his daughter's report cards and student thank you notes. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The community center staff eventually saw that Claire wasn't there to rewrite the past. She was there to work. She was punctual, quiet, and fair. She stayed late to clean. She helped reorganize a storage room no one had touched in 5 years. Elias kept his distance. He didn't pretend history didn't happen. He just refused to let it dictate the future. When one of his students, an orphan boy with a temper and a gift for design, asked why the woman who once hurt his daughters now wore the same badge as the rest of them, Elias said, "Because forgiveness isn't approval. It's release. I forgave her so she'd stop owning space in my chest." That answer traveled. The boy told another student. A teacher overheard. Soon, people stopped whispering and started watching. Zoe eventually visited the center during a weekend seminar. She passed Claire in the hallway. Neither spoke. But later, Zoe told her father, "You don't owe her anything, but I'm glad you gave her nothing more than a chance to earn what she wants from life now." Elias smiled. That was all he needed to hear. Forgiveness didn't rewrite the past. It didn't remove pain or change facts, but made room. It unclenched the fist. It gave Elias one more lesson to teach, not through words, but through example. That strength isn't always the ability to hold on. Sometimes it's the courage to let go and keep walking forward anyway. Zoe earned her 4th stripe and officially became captain after completing her final evaluation flight across 3 continents. Luna, now leading a multinational team of aerospace engineers, received her first patent for a fuel-efficient wing design that could reduce emissions by nearly 20%. Together, they used their savings, grant support, and their growing reputation to build something greater than just careers. They built a legacy. Christiana House stood at the heart of the rural community where their family story began, a multi-purpose center offering free schooling, vocational training, and medical care for families who had never known opportunity. Elias oversaw every corner of it. The carpentry benches in the workshop, the classroom walls painted with quotes from books his daughters once read by flashlight, the clinic lined with beds, and stocked with medicine Zoe once went without. On opening day, the crowd overflowed. Teachers, engineers, villagers, former students, even skeptics came. Elias stepped to the podium, a small card in hand, but he didn't read from it. He looked at the faces, young and old, then said simply, To anyone who ever said investing in daughters was a waste, look again. The applause rose like thunder. Later that evening, he sat alone on the balcony of the house his daughters built for him. His knees ached, his hands were slower, but his spirit was light. He looked up at the night sky where a plane blinked in the distance and whispered, "That promise, it flew higher than I ever imagined." Thank you for watching this incredible journey of sacrifice, belief, and quiet strength. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, hit the like button, and make sure to subscribe to Cracks of Light for more stories that prove hope isn't just an idea. It's something you build one step at a time.